A very warm greetings everyone. Welcome to the lecture series of Introduction to Environmental Economics. Under this we have been talking about environmental regulation. Under environmental regulation we have picked up a topic of pricing emissions. In the earlier lectures we have described about economic incentives, and in detail we have discussed variety of economic incentives existing in the markets. Now, in this lecture, we will continue to comprehend various types of economic incentives, to understand the concept of emission fees, to comprehend the concept of Pigouvian fees, to understand the difference between emission fees and Pigouvian fees, and finally to visualize the cases of single polluter and multiple polluters. So, and what do you understand by emission fees? To price emissions, it is very difficult fundamentally if one tries to quantify in monetary terms the emission pollution. So, how can we quantify in a monetary way an emission fee, and how can we charge it? So, an emission fee as a concept is a price of or a fee paid by the polluter to the regulatory agency or entity for every unit of emission that the polluter emits. So, every unit you emit, you will have to pay a price, and that price or a fee is considered as emission fee. Now, let us consider a firm producing a good, for example, producing an electricity. Producing electricity involves a huge amount of pollution or emission. Let us assume that that amount of pollution is X. If the emission fee is P, small p, and the polluter emits X units of pollution, then automatically the payment from the polluter to the regulator is considered as P into X. The total amount of revenue generated by the regulatory agency or the authority is P into X. To determine how much a polluter must pollute in order to pollute, in the sense what is the amount of emission, optimal amount of emission a polluter can pollute. For identifying that or for determining that, let us consider a framework. Consider a C of X. C of X is the cost of production associated with emitting X units of pollution. So, it means that a firm generating X unit of pollution is associated with cost, and that cost we reflect by C of X, holding goods output as fixed. So, given the amount of production of any good generated by the firm is also generating X amount of pollution or emission. Firm is thus associated with a cost of emission, and that we call as C of X. The cost C, now let us assume or let us understand how this cost C behaves when the emission changes. The C cost declines as X increases. It is important to understand that how the costs are associated with the emission for a firm or a producing agency. The cost C declines as X increases. So, it means that if you emit more, the cost declines. In other words, if you are emitting, you are not paying any cost. It means you are not paying any abatement cost. So, this cost associated with pollution is only when you try to abate it or reduce it. If you increase emission X, then you are actually saving the money by the firm. Thus, the polluter saves money by emitting pollution. Keeping that into consideration, let us understand the total cost of the firm. The total cost to the firm is a combination of two components. abatement cost plus the cost of fees. As you can see in the equation, TCX is equal to C of x plus P of P into x. This total cost of pollution can be broken up into two parts, C of x and P into x. C of x is abatement cost and P into x is the total cost fee generated and taken up by the regulator. Now, this total cost, which is a function in pollution, has to be minimized. So, the objective of all the firms is to minimize the total cost. For minimization of the total cost, the first derivative of total cost must be equated to 0. This implies that the first derivative of Tc with respect to x should be equated to 0. Once you do that, first derivative condition tells us that T dash x plus P is equal to 0. Once we do the first order condition, P is equated to minus C dash x, which is finally equated to minus MCX. Minus MCX, as it sounds, that it is negative of marginal cost of x. And finally, one can look at it in a different angle and say that negative of the cost is nothing but the savings. So, minus MCX is equated to MSX. Now, it is interesting to understand this equation. This equation suggests that the firm chooses to operate where the marginal savings from emitting one more additional unit of pollution is equated to the price of pollution. Now, what is price of pollution here? Price is, we have already assumed in this framework that the firm is charged P amount of fee per unit of pollution, per unit of x. So, the price per unit is P. So, when we do the minimizing the cost, we come up with a condition that P is equated to minus MCX, which is further equated to MSX. So, price indirectly, price, that is emission fee, is for optimality is equated to negative of marginal cost of pollution, and it can also be considered in another way that it is equated to marginal savings of pollution. So, at optimal emission, so where does the firm should optimally emit? That optimal amount of emission is considered as the quantity x star. At optimal amount of emission x star, the price is equated to minus MC x star and it is further equated to marginal savings x star. This is the optimal amount of emission x star. Now, in order to understand that why it became an optimal amount of emission, let us deviate from this x star. There are two ways of doing it. We can easily go to the left hand side of x star, we can reduce the quantity of x star lesser than x star, and in the second case we can increase the quantity of x star, that is emission. Okay, let us first take the case when we are reducing the pollution quantity emission x lesser than x star, and understand that why all the values or all the quantities which are lesser than x star are not optimal. For doing that, let us move lesser than x star. Suppose we reduce the quantity of x star from x star to x dash, which is lesser than x star. It means we are reducing the amount of pollution, and that will involve abatement cost. If you are reducing the amount of pollution, that involves abatement cost. A firm, so you visualize in this way that a firm that is trying to reduce x star is making an extra cost. So, for reducing x star amount, a firm is actually incurring a cost, and that we are calling it as abatement cost. So as you reduce emission lesser than X star, you are actually increasing per unit of abatement cost, marginal cost. So if you compare the situation, marginal cost of abatement will be greater than the cost per unit of emission P. So as you move left hand side of X star, you are incurring a higher cost per unit. As a result, lowering emission raises the total cost, and therefore the total cost of the firm increases if you try to emit lesser value than the optimal value of X star. So it is not definitely viable for the firm to emit lesser than X star. So we have proved a point that a firm should actually emit X star and not lesser than X star. So X star is a point where the marginal cost of abatement is equated to the price fee, negative of the marginal cost, and we are calling the negative of the marginal cost as marginal savings. Lower emissions imply more abatement cost, and thus it raises the total cost. So therefore, it is not viable for the firm to emit more, or you reduce the emission more than X star. Optimally, you should emit only X star. You should not try to reduce emission lesser than X star. Now let us consider the opposite side. The other side case is that you start emitting more than X star. Emitting a larger amount of pollution or more than X star would imply that your abatement costs are reducing. You are no more making any effort of reducing the emission. So automatically the C-X, which is the marginal cost of abatement, is going to reduce and is going to become lesser and lesser than the price emission fee P. As you increase your emissions more than X star, C-X is lesser than P. And as a result, you would see that increasing emissions will increase your total cost. Total cost of emission, which is made up of the marginal cost, which is made up of the cost, abatement cost, and plus the fee, emission fee which you pay to the agencies, to the regulatory agencies. So if you try to emit more than X star, then the cost of it, increasing the emission will be actually reducing the cost. An increase in the emission means less abatement cost, and fee payment increases more rapidly as compared to the abatement cost. So as a result, the impact on the total cost is total cost starts rising. So it's not again viable to increase emission more than X star, and the reason is that your fee starts increasing. If you emit more, you will have to pay P per unit of price on each every unit emitted, and that is why Px quantities part of the total cost will start rising, and as a result the total cost will also start rising. Therefore, we would land up with the same situation that X star becomes the optimal amount of emission, and it is that level of emission which equates P to the negative of marginal cost of emission, or in other words also equated to the marginal savings of emission. Finally, a firm that is faced with the emission fees will abate a pollution only up to a point where the marginal cost of abatement or marginal savings from emitting is equated to the emission fee, which is P. Thus, we would also say apply the equi-marginal principle, which we have been talking about in the last lecture also, that the equi-marginal principle will automatically hold. Let us see how the equi-marginal principle holds in this case when we have the emission fee. Each firm sets the marginal cost of abatement equal to the same number that is phi, and that phi is P. Every firm will try to equate, because the optimality condition says that for optimal emission you have to equate your negative of marginal cost to the price P, which is the emission fee. So every firm would try to would like to reach the optimality and would like to equate the marginal cost to its price P. Now let us assume that there are two firms. There are two firms, firm 1 and firm 2. By visualizing their marginal savings to the firm from emitting, we can draw both the marginal saving curves and marginal cost curves. Now, suppose we consider two firms and we try to put them together in a graph, then we will draw both the sides, marginal cost side and marginal saving side. In optimality, we discussed that marginal cost, negative of marginal cost is considered as marginal savings. Marginal savings are actually depicted as function of emissions, same as the cost, marginal costs. By emitting one more unit, there is a cost saving for each of the firm. Basically, if you emit more, it means you are not abating and reducing emission, and you are not spending anything for reducing emission. Therefore, increasing emission basically means you are saving on cost, and the saving graph in the form of marginal saving curve can be depicted in the graph as follows on the screen. You can see on the screen there are two graphs. On left hand side of the graph, you can see that the marginal saving curves are downward sloping, and we on this left hand side we can depict that emissions are plotted horizontally while the marginal savings are plotted vertically. So as you emit more and more, you tend to save, but initial levels of emissions you are able to save more, but if you start increasing your emission, you are able to save lesser and lesser. So the slope, negative slope of marginal saving curve depicts that increasing emission, though you try to save more by increasing emission, but the marginal savings are become lesser and lesser, because as you start emitting more and more, the rate at which you are able to save starts reducing. So the curves of marginal saving curves are downward sloping, and they are downward sloping for both the firms, firm 1 and firm 2. On the right hand side of the graph, we depict the abatement costs. As you can see, in case of abatement, as you emit more, they both are related. These two graphs are related. If you emit more and you move from 0 to right hand side on the first graph, it means you are moving towards the left hand side in graph 2, because if you emit, then it means you are reducing abatement. Abatement is opposite of emission. So once you're moving from left to right on the graph right hand side, graph 2, you're moving from right to left. And once you do that right to left, it means as you abate more and more, you are adding up to your marginal costs. And marginal cost functions are therefore are increasing functions related to as function of abatement. So it's important to understand that the marginal cost of abatement is a function in abatement, while the marginal saving function is a function in emission. They both behave in an opposite manner. So if you abate more, you are adding up to the cost of the firm, and if you emit more, you are savings. You are saving adding up to the savings of the firm. So as you can see in the graph, there is a price amount, P amount of price being charged by the regulatory authorities. This P amount of price is traveling from the left graph and to the right graph, and it remains same. So where does the equilibrium happen? In the optimization condition, we saw that the equilibrium should happen at P, wherever P is equated to marginal minus of marginal costs, and further it is equated to marginal savings. So minus of marginal cost is wherever you get for individual firm graphs. As you can see, there are MC1 and MC2 for firm 1 and firm 2, MS1 and MS2 for firm 1 and firm 2. So wherever you get this equated equilibrium, or whichever point you get P equated to minus MC and further it is equated to MS, that point becomes the optimal amount of emission and optimal amount of abatement. Opposite of emission is abatement. So on the right hand side of the panel, the marginal abatement costs are depicted with no pollution regulation. Let us see now, if suppose there is no regulation at all, then it would definitely mean that there is no abatement and the emissions are full capacity. So the maximum possible emissions will be at point on the left hand side of the graph, where you can see that they are at E1 bar and E2 bar, while the abatement will be at 0 origin, because there will be no abatement if there is no regulation. So there will be no abatement. In case of no regulation, full emission will be there, and you can see in the panels E1 bar and E2 bar, and in case on the 0 abatement on the other side. Now let us suppose if we put regulation with an emission fee P, the two firms will try to cut back their emissions because they have to pay a price on emission. So therefore automatically they would try to reduce emission from E1 bar and E2 bar. In doing so, they increase abatement. Reducing emission automatically means that you are increasing abatement. Therefore, the two firms will move from 0 point on the right hand side panel graph from 0 towards right hand side, and on the left hand side panel graph they will move from right to left, both the firms. So firms operate where the marginal cost of abatement or marginal savings from the pollution are exactly equated to the emission fee. At that point, they would try to stop. One of the crucial significance of this emission fee is that the point of equi-marginal principle is automatically attained, because two firms will face the same emission fee, so they both set their marginal cost of abatement to the same number P, and thus marginal cost will be equalized for both the firms because they are both setting their marginal cost equating to P, because they are charged with the same emission fee. So automatically their marginal cost will be equalized. So the two firms, or among the several firms, they will be facing the same emission fee and they will be equalizing their marginal cost indirectly. Now let us come to the next concept of fees or regulatory economic incentives. The next concept of variety of economic incentive is Pigouvian fee. We have done, or we have reviewed emission fee now, and now we are going to take up another type of variety of fee, that is called as Pigouvian fee. Usually the general tendency is to take both emission fee and Pigouvian fee in the same manner, but there is a difference. There is a theoretical difference between the two concepts, and a century ago Arthur C. Pigou, environmental economist, argued for the imposition of tax on generators of pollution, and that is why this particular fee which he oriented or recommended is referred to as Pigouvian fee. The Pigouvian fee is a special kind of emission fee, an emission fee that is set at marginal damage of pollution. Pigou recommended that one should look not at the emission level, one should look at the damage caused by the emission. And it is an important attempt to restore the Pareto optimality situation of market failure. So, according to the theory of Pigou, he originated or he defined, formulated a criteria or a fee structure that will be called as Pigouvian fee. We will come back to the Pigouvian fee details and discussion after a short break. Thank you so much.